Okay, so can everybody hear me? The online audience? Give us a sign that you're with us.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so welcome everyone to this Mumble seminar. We're very happy to have here today Professor Fabrice Teroni from the University of Geneva. Fabrice works in the areas of philosophy of mind and epistemology. His work focuses on the philosophy of memory, perception, and emotions, and he has published numerous articles and monographs on the theory of emotions, among which The Emotions: A Philosophical Introduction to Routledge in 2012, The Nature of Shame. The book is In Defense of Shame, The Faces of an Emotion for Oxford University Press in 2011, and on memory. His interests also include the nature of emotions evoked by fiction, the involvement of the self in emotions, moral psychology, metaethics, and the phenomenology and epistemology of memory. His research is mainly conducted within the Thumos Research Group in Geneva that he directs along with Julien Dernat. And the title of his presentation today is Affective Selves, Streams of Consciousness, and Mental Time Travels. So welcome, Fabrice, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martha. Can you hear me too? Is it fine?
Not very loud.
Okay, I will. And now, is it good?
That's better.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try. Maybe I'll sit. Otherwise, I have a tendency to move around. So if I sit, it's better. So thank you very much, Martha, for the nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here and for the invitation. So today what I want to do is to present to you some issues at the crossroads between philosophy of, let's say, philosophy of personal identity on the one hand and philosophy of emotions on the other hand. And in particular, I will be interested in our sense of diachronic identity. So as you all know, when philosophers are interested in this sense of diachronic identity, they have typically emphasized a sort of lived psychological continuity that somehow shapes our sense of being the same person across time. And traditionally, of course, they have emphasized the continuity generated by memory, or more generally, mental time travel connections. And more recently, they have been much interested in the continuity characteristic of streams of consciousness as such. Let me just expand a bit on these two types or two senses of continuity. So regarding memory, or more generally mental time travel, the idea is as follows. When a subject remembers, okay, this is typically accompanied by a sense for that subject herself that she's identical with the individual who previously experienced the relevant objects or events. There's a very famous passage in the essay of Locke where he writes that memory is a power to revive perceptions which the mind has once had, with this additional perception annexed to them that it has had them before. And a closely related additional perception in this Lockean phrase accompanies mental time travel. For instance, when we project ourselves in fictional or future-oriented or possible scenarios. So in what follows, I shall concentrate exclusively on these types, let us put it that way, of mental time travel. Now, as regards streams of consciousness, there's also a sense of phenomenal connectedness to psychological states that succeed one another within any stream of consciousness. Very hard to pin down exactly or to analyze in any way this phenomenal connectedness, but here is a nice quote by from Dainton and Bain. A typical stream of consciousness is not a succession of discrete experiential atoms. Far from it. Each brief phase of a stream of consciousness is experienced as flowing into the next. Think of what it is like to suffer a prolonged toothache, to hear an extended tone played on a flute, etc., etc. Now, it's clear that these two sorts of continuity, that generated by mental thought travel and that generated by streams of consciousness as such, they clearly account for a substantial amount of our sense of diachronic identity. But perhaps philosophers have pictured in a wrong way or in a partial way our sense of diachronic identity by exclusively focusing on these two aspects. Why? Because there are some data that I will briefly present later that suggest that what is most important to this sense of diachronic identity are rather long-standing traits, and in particular character and personality traits. And I will argue that these traits build essentially upon our affective states. So my aim here would be to motivate the idea that some affective states, character and personality traits, shape our sense of diachronic identity. And on this basis, I want to explore how affect impacts on lived psychological continuity. And the aim here is somehow to try to build bridges between affective approaches and more traditional accounts of the sense of continuity which appeal to streams of consciousness or memory, mental time travel, more generally connections. So here is the plan. I will first present briefly this data. That's the first section. Then I will focus on the nature of character and personality traits. I will argue in the third section that these traits essentially build on our emotional states. And I will try to articulate the function of the affective self. And then on this backdrop, I will be interested in the impact of emotions in the stream of consciousness and on the stream of consciousness, sorry, and on memory in the two last sections. But first, let me say a few words about this empirical data. There are a series of seemingly, always have to be careful with this empirical data in particular in these domains, but these ones seem to be quite robust. And according to this data, subjects think that the capacity to remember is less crucial for diachronic personal identity than the preservation of two types of traits: moral traits, which are often described together as constituting one's moral self on the one hand, and personality traits on the other hand. As a sort of interesting focus, we can discuss or can briefly present the studies conducted by Strominger and Nichols in 2014. They have tapped into subjects' intuitions about personal identity after significant changes, okay, for instance, due to brain transplant. Fictional, that is to say. Yeah? It's tapping into the subject's intuitions about the preservation of identity through time. And Strominger and Nichols, as many others conducting the same sorts of studies, were interested in whether and how intuitions about personal identity are modulated by the psychological consequences of the relevant change. So that's, for instance, the first study in this 2014 paper. Here, they tested subjects' intuitions regarding what happens after a brain transplant. And you can see on the screen that according to the subjects, changes, so agnosia, for instance, that one is, refers to the fact that the subject after the brain transplant was said to have forgotten knowledge about general facts. Apathy has to do with the absence of desire. Amnesia has to do with the lack of personal memories. And then you have for crucial events in one's own past. And then you have this category of morality, which subsumes traits such as honesty, trustworthiness, loyalty, politeness, etc., etc., usually called character traits. And you can see that the subjects were strongly inclined to say that changes in morality, so that is to say changes in these character traits, someone was before the brain transplant, for instance, honest or dishonest, and then switched to being honest or dishonest, as the case may be, they were claimed by the subjects to be much more relevant to assessments of identity change than changes in one's capacity, for instance, to remember one's personal past. There was a second, there's actually a series of studies, but in the second study, Strominger and Nichols made two changes. The first one was to check whether the brain transplant part of the scenario was creating some noise. So they claimed in that second study that the changes were due to the absorption of a special drug, sort of, they called it magic bullet drug, as opposed to brain transplant. And they added also personality traits or changes in personality traits. That is to say, changes regarding being shy, anxious, industrious, creative, etc., etc. And according to these results of the second study, you see also that both changes in personality traits and changes in character traits or morality tend to elicit in subjects stronger intuitions regarding identity change than changes having to do with desires or memories. Here is Strominger and Nichols' own way to describe their results. The moral faculty is the part of the mind most likely to be seen as the ultimate explanation for whether a person's identity endures or fades away. That is, subjects in the moral deficit condition did not, by and large, recourse to explaining its importance in terms of other underlying factors. So what's the key claim that you can extract and that these philosophers and psychologists have extracted from these sorts of data? Well, obviously, pre-theoretically, we all know that our sense of diachronic identity is up to a point structured to a significant extent by character and personality traits. We often say things like Max was not himself during the party. This is not the Alexandra I have known. But the data, according to these philosophers and psychologists, seem to suggest something much more radical. That is to say that our sense of diachronic identity is much more generally structured around what I will call the evaluative self. And evaluative self is just a handy way for me to refer to the relevant traits, that is to say, character and personality traits. And I shall justify the use of the label below. And the justification, as you will see, has to do with the fact that these traits, according to the claim I will present, are essentially built around our emotional states. Now, this raises two issues. The first one I just alluded to: how should we understand the evaluative self? How should we understand the nature of these character and personality traits? And I will present, as I announced, a sort of emotion-based account in sections 2 and 3. And then the second issue these results raise is: how does the evaluative self relate to lived psychological continuity? That is to say, the sort of continuity characteristic of memory on the one hand and the stream of consciousness on the other hand. That's of course the issue you have to confront if you want to build bridges between traditional accounts of the sense of psychological continuity in terms of memory, stream of consciousness on the one hand, and those accounts that you can build on the basis of this data in terms of character and personality traits. And this is what I will do in the in sections 4 and 5. Okay, so what about character and personality traits? My main claim here would be will be to say that character and personality traits have an intimate and essential connection to values and evaluations, and this is because of this connection between character and personality traits and values and evaluations that it makes sense to describe, character and personality traits as elements or parts of one's evaluative self. Now, intuitively, what can we say about the nature of character and personality traits? It seems that, to me at least, that the most intuitively compelling thing to say about these traits is to say that they are structured around the value or disvalue of certain types of situations, or more abstractly, around values or disvalues themselves. And that somehow a given character trait is a way of describing the weight a value or type of situation has in a given subject's reasoning and behavior. So to drive the idea home, consider two examples. The first one, being honest, is a character trait. Now, someone who is honest is first and foremost characterized by the weight truth and truthfulness have for her. It is someone for whom issues or considerations pertaining to truth and truthfulness channel the reasoning and behavior in specific directions. Okay? Someone who is honest will put a given weight to these considerations and will reach conclusions that about what he or she has to do, for instance, that will not be reached by someone who is dishonest, for instance. Okay? And someone who is honest is also characterized by the sorts of actions she will make on the basis of these conclusions about what truth and truthfulness demand. Now, things are more or less the same regarding personality traits. Okay? Consider being shy, for instance. Someone who is shy is, again, first and foremost, someone for whom the disvalue of public exposure has a certain weight. Okay? Someone who is shy is someone who is reasoning on the basis of considerations of public exposure to specific conclusions. Okay? He or she wants to avoid these situations. He or she will be ready to meet certain negative consequences to himself just because he wants to avoid public exposure, and so on and so forth. So in all these cases, it seems to me quite attractive to say that these traits, be they character or personality traits, are characterized by the way a certain value or disvalue of a certain type of situation has for the relevant subject. Now, these sorts of pre-theoretical descriptions of what we mean by character and personality traits, they suggest a series of important points about them. The first one is that character and personality traits have both a cognitive and a conative sides. Okay, so in both cases of being honest and being shy, you have on the one hand a sort of attention grabbing. Okay, for instance, the honest person is someone who is reliably detecting situations in which truth and truthfulness are relevant. Okay? In the same way, someone who is shy is someone who is reliably disposed to detect the relevant kinds of situations. There will be a public exposure, and so on and so forth. That's the first cognitive side of these traits. There's also obviously a conative side of the traits. Okay, there's not only the detection of the relevant situations, but also a specific type of motivation on the basis of the detection of these situations. Someone who is a pathological liar, for instance, is also, like the honest person, someone who is quite reliably disposed to detect situations in which truthfulness is required. But these are as many situations for him that provide occasions to deceive. Okay? So that's the two sides of character traits. Other important aspects of character traits that I will use to motivate the idea that they are first and foremost constituted by emotional dispositions is that they operate without reflection. Okay? Typically, someone who is honest detects the relevant situation and is motivated to act without much reflection, right? Of course, on the margins, in difficult cases and so on and so forth, we will have reflection, but this is not the central case. And finally, someone with the relevant trait is not, because of that, in any distinctive psychological state, right? There's no psychological state that characterizes the shy person or the honest person at any given moment. Right? The relevant psychological states to understand the nature of these traits will, of course, be function of different circumstances. Someone who is shy or someone who is honest will be in characteristic psychological states depending on the circumstances. So a bit like other types of mental states, perhaps like beliefs, for instance, we can describe before going into the detail, these traits as multi-track psychological dispositions. That is to say that they are dispositions, psychological dispositions on the one hand, and that they manifest in many different ways. So if that's along the right track, then the next issue is the following one. What are the central conscious manifestations of these multi-track dispositions that are character and personality traits? And as I said, I want to argue that emotions are the central manifestations of these traits. And then, sorry, I forgot to mention that then on this backdrop in this same section, I will say a few words about the function of character and personality traits. Now, it seems to me that, again, intuitively speaking, it's quite attractive to think that emotions are the central manifestations of character and personality traits. Consider the following examples again. The honest person is someone glad to see the truth honored, disappointed or indignant if she realizes that someone is insincere, shameful perhaps if she herself lies on a given occasion, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the shy person fears the risk of public exposure, is embarrassed or ashamed when it materializes, and so on and so forth. So it seems that intuitively, again, it's quite plausible to draw a close connection between these traits and emotions. But perhaps we can say something more about why this is the case. And this is what I will do now before, as I mentioned, saying a few words about the psychological function of these traits. So if the idea is that emotions constitute the central manifestations of character and personality traits. And this seems to be on the right track. Why? Because emotions have, so to say, the right psychological pedigree to implement the idea that character and personality traits have a cognitive and conative side and all the other properties that I mentioned before. But to see why this is the case, we have to say a bit more about the psychological profile of the emotions themselves. So here is a sketch of what emotions are. First, emotions, and this is at least something very widespread in the contemporary literature, are best characterized as sorts of evaluations. That is to say that someone in a given emotion, in one way or another, evaluates an object positively or negatively. The intentional structure of the emotions is a bit more complex than that. Typically, we distinguish the particular object of the emotion from its formal object. So the particular object of the emotion is the object about which you have the emotion. And it is always provided by another mental state. So for instance, you are afraid of the dog you see, or ashamed of a deed you remember, and so on and so forth. That's the particular object of the emotion provided by another mental state. And then you have what philosophers often describe as the formal objects of the emotions. And this has to do precisely with the evaluation. So for instance, in fear, the dog is somehow evaluated as being a threat. This is what the fear adds to the, say, visual perception on which it is based. Okay. Same for offense in the case of anger, loss in the case of sadness, and success in the case of joy, and so on and so forth. Then emotions are also characterized by their automaticity. Okay, the sort of evaluation I was mentioning is typically not the result of a series of conscious assessments of the object. Okay, typically, emotions strike us, and the sort of evaluation that is constitutive of the emotion is undergone automatically, typically subpersonally, so to say. Emotions have also a key connection to tension, right? Someone who is in a given emotional state has his or her attention channeled in a specific way so as to deal with the relevant object. Okay? Think of any emotion, it is always informative and illuminating to understand it in terms or to emphasize the way it structures and channels the subject's attention so as to deal with a specific object. And then finally, emotions, since it's also a key aspect of their psychological profile, have an important connection, many claim an essential connection with action tendencies, right? Again, you can think of fear and the tendency to avoid the object of fear, disgust and the tendency to put some distance, a subtly different way than in the case of fear with the object of disgust, to try to avoid sensory contact in that case. Think of a positive emotion like admiration, in which the tendency is to delve into objects, to further get information about it, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the psychological profile of the emotion. Observe also that in light of what I have said about the variety of manifestations of character traits, that we can appeal, if we want to implement the idea that character traits are first, or personality traits are first and foremost manifest in emotions, we can appeal to a variety of emotions, right? You have future-oriented emotions, hope, anxiety, for instance. You have present-oriented emotions, and you have also past-oriented emotions, right? They seem to be interesting ways of accounting for the variety of manifestations characteristic of these traits. Now, if you think, you agree that the following rough characterization of the emotions is along the right track, we can now easily implement the two sides of character and personality traits in terms of emotions. Consider the cognitive side or the value detection side of these traits. The idea is that emotions are ideally suited to implement this aspect of character and personality traits insofar as they are value experiences relying on non-demanding evaluation processes that channel the subject's cognitive resources in specific ways. Now consider what I've described as the cognitive side of character and personality traits. That is to say, what has to do with the distinctive motivation of someone who has this character and personality trait or personality trait. But here again, emotions are ideally suited because or in virtue of their connection with action tendencies. So it seems that not only is the idea that emotions are central manifestations of character and personality traits quite intuitive, but that it is intuitive in light or because of the specific psychological profile of emotions. Now, observe in passing on this same issue that the attentional and action tendencies aspects of the emotions are closely intertwined. They are not separated from one another. During an emotion or an emotional episode, that is to say that the subject's cognitive resources are channeled so as to deal in a specific way with the particular object. Two are closely connected to another. On this basis, let me say perhaps a few words about the function of character and personality traits. It seems to me that these traits have the following function. They lend structure and resilience to our psychology. And this is something that becomes clear once we integrate our starting point, that is to say, the idea that someone with a given trait gives a specific weight to a value or disvalue. We integrate this idea and the claim that character and personality traits are multi-track dispositions. So if you integrate these two ideas, you get this: the various emotions that manifest a given trait in varying circumstances work in partnership, so to say, and as a consequence of that, a value has a given weight or a given subject. So character and personality traits organize emotions and they channel them to specific ends, so to say, to which we would be blind in their absence. So this is to say, for instance, that without something like honesty, that is to say, without a series of emotions that are orchestrated depending on the circumstances by something like a character trait, we would be blind to the promotion of truth. This is something we could not be attuned to. And in the same way, in the case of shyness, we would be blind to something like the end of avoidance, the end constituted by the avoidance of social exposure. This is something that Alexander Schand, for instance, has emphasized beautifully in his classic The Foundations of Character. Here he's speaking about love, but I think it's faithful to what he has in mind, that he wanted to say exactly the same of character traits. He writes, sorrow in absence being eliminated, the momentary connection formed with an object is quickly obliterated, and nothing is loved because nothing is missed. So the idea here is that there are ends, there are values that we can relate to only insofar as we have a psychology which is orchestrated in the way it is orchestrated in someone who has the relevant character or personality traits. So to wrap up these ideas, giving weight to a value is a matter of having your psychology organized so as to respond to the demands that a value imposes on us. And these demands fluctuate as a function of the circumstances. And individual emotions, or generally episodic states, which are not organized in specific ways, channeled in specific ways, do not fit the bill. So what is required for giving weight to a value or disvalue are stable and organized systems of responses. And character and personality traits are just that. So this is their function. Okay, so just a conclusion of this section, character and personality traits play a key role in structuring our psychological lives. As I've argued briefly, their relations to emotions, values, and evaluations justify the label affective self. Now, as we've seen in the empirical section, the affective selves shape our sense of diachronic identity. And now I want to try to answer the following question in order to build bridges between these sorts of emphasis on character and personality traits and more traditional emphasis on mental time travel and streams of consciousness. The question is, how exactly does the affective self impact on lived psychological continuity? I shall start with the stream of consciousness and then move on to mental time travel. So, given that emotions are the central manifestations of character traits, we have to understand how emotions manifest or are present in the stream of consciousness to answer this part of the questions. I observe that if the typical manifestations of the evaluative self were punctual mental phenomena, something like judgments, say, which do not take time, then the impact of the affective self on streams of consciousness would be minimal. But as I've argued, the typical manifestations of the character and personality traits are emotions. So how do emotions occupy consciousness? There's a sort of widespread tendency, both in contemporary psychology and contemporary philosophy, to emphasize that emotions are types of psychological processes. So they are not states, they are not mere episodes, they have the shape, the temporal shape of processes. Now, the process typically starts with the noticing of a significant event. Right? Basic case, say, suddenly your attention is drawn to, you notice a form lurking in the shadows. Your attention then focuses on that event. Say you become afraid. Okay? Next, the emotions the emotion follows a course, which is the joint upshot of what is happening in the environment and the changes that the emotion itself orchestrates. So for instance, in our toy case, say you suddenly realize that this shadow is actually a dangerous predator. Start to prepare to move. Still don't know what to do. Okay, the sort of movement you make is detected by the predator. You wait a bit to see what is happening. Will he attack or not? Okay, so here it's the emotion has already orchestrated changes and will monitor these changes in order to, for instance, in that case, flee the threat. So just one example to see what people have in mind when they insist on the idea that emotions have the temporal shapes of psychological processes. So they have a lived psychological continuity and they structure the way our psychological lives unfold, right? Somehow stretches of our psychological lives are structured around the emotions we have. Accordingly, we may want to say the following: what individuates most emotional episodes is not the uniformity of a given representational content. Why? Well, because in all these cases, within the process, the representational content is likely to change quite a lot between the first moment when you become afraid of the moving shadow and the moment where you say successfully flee and jump on a tree, something like this. Representational content is likely to change quite a lot. So this is not what is constant within emotional processes. What is constant is rather the presence of a system that organizes consciousness and channel it so as to modify or maintain, as the case may be, a subject-environment relation. So in the case of fear, what is constant is the presence of a system during the whole process, which is fear, whose aim is to avoid something. Admiration system whose aim is to further explore the relevant object. In sadness, coping with the loss, and so on and so forth. That's what is constant in these emotional processes as opposed to a given representation. But this is something that has been nicely emphasized, for instance, in Evans, not Gareth, the previous Evans, talk of master ideas that organize attention. This is a very interesting idea that has been forgotten for a long time before coming back in the literature. According to Evans, in many cases, and in particular in the cases of the emotions, there are what he describes as master ideas that structure our psychological lives without themselves being conscious. And the idea here, if you go back to our previous examples, is that someone or something which is in a process of fear has here her or its or his consciousness organized around the avoidance of something that is dangerous, but thoughts or representations of danger need not enter its consciousness for that to be the case, and so on and so forth for all emotions. So if you remember what I said about the distinction between particular and formal objects in the case of the emotions, you see that according to this idea, the formal objects of the emotions, that is to say the relation to the relevant value, okay, danger, loss, offense, and so on and so forth, has to do with these master ideas. And if we follow Evans, that suggests that these master ideas, these values are not represented in emotions. They are characteristic of the way our consciousness is structured, but they are not represented by any state in, or at least they need not be in emotions. Okay, so now if that's along the right track, you can see that in the same way as character and personality traits, but of course on a different temporal scale, emotions also lend structure to our psychology, right? They orchestrate in short-term processes our conscious life in something parallel to the way that traits orchestrate our psychological life on a longer temporal scale, so to say. We have seen, and I've followed Alexander Shand on this idea that traits have the richness needed to anchor the idea of giving weight to a value. But as I said in my little sketch of the psychological profile of emotions, emotions themselves are evaluative experiences. They somehow relate to values. As many philosophers nowadays are fond to say, they are correct or incorrect as a function of whether the particular object has a given value. So for instance, your fear of the dog is correct if the dog is dangerous. Your anger at an offense is correct if or at a remark, sorry, is correct if the remark is offensive. It is not correct if the remark is innocent, for instance. Now, so there are also evaluative experiences. And what I've said until now suggests that there being evaluative experiences consists in the fact that emotions organize and occupy consciousness in specific processual ways. And actually, this is quite an attractive idea because this claim, this idea that somehow the evaluative nature of the emotions has to do with the way they organize consciousness and attention shapes our conception of the intentionality and correctness conditions of the emotions. So here is the idea. Our conception of the relevant values, threats, offenses, losses, the shameful, and so on and so forth, is essentially the conception of something that merits to occupy consciousness and attention in specific ways. Okay? This is one way of cashing out an idea that is at the center of most, if not all, fitting attitude analysis of value. According to this, or in the case at hand of value concepts, the idea is somehow that our understanding, our most basic understanding of what the relevant values are, builds on our understanding of what specific types of responses, in the case at hand, emotional responses are. And it seems to me to be quite an attractive idea to say that our conception, in the light of what I have said about the way emotions occupy consciousness, that our conception of the relevant values is essentially the conception of something that merits to occupy consciousness and attention in specific ways. So for instance, our most basic conception of what offenses are is as something that merits to be dealt with in the way characteristic of anger, and so on and so forth. Now, our assessment of the emotions, if that's along the right track, and their correctness conditions, right, whether they are correct or incorrect, essentially depends on this way of occupying attention and its duration. So we are prone to say things like, you have been angry for too long, you should stop. And here, or you have been afraid for too long, and so on, or you have grieved for too long, and so on and so forth. And here the idea, if you take what I have said seriously, is that this should is not a moral or a prudential should, but often is an epistemological should. Okay? The idea being that a loss after a while should not, epistemically, should not occupy attention anymore. It has occupied attention sufficiently. Epistemically speaking, it has been given its due, epistemically speaking. And you can see how this contrasts completely with the way we assess intellectual states for correctness, states such as judgments and beliefs. Right? We never say something like, you have judged that P too many times, right? You shouldn't do that anymore. So this suggests, and this has suggested to people like Naaman, for instance, or that Naaman, for instance, in a very nice paper, that somehow the key to understanding the specificity of affective states and their correctness conditions has to do with the specific way they, so to say, consume attention, as opposed to intellectual states. So, conclusion of this section, and I have only a very brief 5 minutes last section, and then I'm done. Conclusion of this section, there's a deep relation between emotions and the stream of consciousness. In organizing our psychological lives around what I've called, after Evans, master ideas, emotions are central determinants of our sense of psychological continuity. That's what I wanted to say about the relations between emotions and the stream of consciousness. What about the connections between emotions and memory? There are many things to say. I will briefly focus here on only two relations between emotions and memory, two relations which are especially important given our focus on diachronic identity and our sense of diachronic identity. So the first relation takes place at the time of encoding, that is to say, at the time when we form memories. As we have seen, emotions capture attention in specific ways. There's a series of empirical data that confirm what is theoretically quite convincing. That is to say that the encoding of emotionally arousing material is enhanced. The effect of this enhanced encoding is specific to the salient object, which is better remembered. But at the time of encoding, we can say the following about the relations between emotions and memory. Emotions focus the subject's attention on significant objects. This enhances encoding and subsequently what we are in a position to remember. A second relation between emotions and memory takes place at the time of recall, at the time we remember. Most memories, of course, are dispositional, and they are accessed only if some specific condition is met. Specific cue, for instance, a question, or say a handkerchief or something like this, depending on the case, prompts your memory, and what was merely a dispositional state becomes an episode of actively remembering. Now, amongst the conditions that make memories manifest, affective ones are extremely important. This is the basis of the so-called mood congruence effect. This is a very documented phenomenon, which is the following one. When you are in a given emotional state, you are more likely to remember events of a similar emotional quality compared to neutral events or events of different emotional qualities, right? For instance, when you are in a sad mood, okay, you will tend to remember negative aspects of our lives. You can actively try to remember the good old days or positive things, but it takes time and effort. Okay, what is typical is that you will concentrate, and the memories about the similarly affectively toned episodes will take center stage. Observe that mood congruence offers a new perspective on our sense of diachronic identity. Consider, for instance, neo-Lockean approaches, such as the famous approach advocated by Derek Parfit. And ask yourself the following question: which amongst your memories play an identity constitutive role? Do all memories qualify, or only those memories that are somehow accessed at some point? Second question, do all accessed memories qualify equally, or is their contribution a function of the number of times they are accessed? Well, it seems to me that memory's role may depend indeed on how frequently they are accessed. And if this is along the right track, our sense of diachronic identity is profoundly influenced by the emotions we undergo. Why? Well, because again, these emotions, through this mood congruence effect, will somehow shape the sorts of memories that are accessible to you at different points in time. So, at the time of coding, as well as at the time of recall, memory is profoundly influenced by affective states, and sense of diachronic identity has been shaped by the emotions we have felt, and it continues to be shaped by the emotions we feel when we remember. This is the conclusion I wanted to reach about the connections between emotions and memories. And so is my general conclusion. So, started from the idea that character and personality traits shape our sense of diachronic identity. I've argued that emotions are the central manifestations of these traits, and on this backdrop, I explored their impact on lived psychological continuity. I've suggested that emotions structure two forms of lived psychological continuity, namely streams of consciousness and mental time travel, that are essential to our sense of diachronic identity. So that's the end. Thank you very much for your attention.